Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Sophos MDR ThreatCast September 2025 edition. My name is Greg Iddon, Security Services Architect here in Sophos MDR. As always, got a number of fantastic people alongside to help deliver the content. We've got Morgan Dembowski from the Threat Intelligence team, Colin Cowie from Threat Intelligence as well, and we've got Paul Jaramillo, who's the Director of Threat Intel and Hunt, who'll be taking us through some hunting. But let's go take a little peep at the agenda. So Morgan's going to go through the threat landscape, what's been going on in the wider world outside of MDR. Colin's going to take us through the observed threat activity, what we've been observing in the MDR operations team, and Intel and Hunt and so on. Paul's going to take us through some threat hunting highlights, some interesting ones this month, so stick around for those. And then I'll take us through a quick review of what's been going on in the wider XOps team, our kind of joint task force between our kind of labs, security operations team, MDR, incident response, and so on. And at the end, we'll do Q&A. But as always, if you have any questions at all, be it about the content, be it about cybersecurity, be it about Sophos, be it about, I don't know, something hopefully related to what we're doing, there's a Q&A panel you'll see in the right-hand side of your screen, I believe, should be there. Just click Q&A and fire in your questions as we go. What we'll do is I'll either interject, if it's a good question and it's pertinent to what's going on, I'll ask the speaker to talk to it then and there, or we'll answer it in just via text. Or we'll hold on to it and we'll touch on it in the Q&A at the end. Yes, this question is probably going to come up. So yes, we are recording the video recording and references and everything will be uploaded to the Sophos MDR community channel. Roughly now within the next 72 hours, there's a process change in marketing. I need to now deliver it to them and then they'll give me it's a time frame of about 3 days total to get it done, but it should hopefully be done sooner. But I'm going to put the bigger band there, so 72 hours max. Before we get started, one tiny piece of coming soon news. So if you've joined the Sophos CTU Live sort of webinar, which is by the Counter Threat Unit at Sophos, ThreatCast and CTU Live will be merging at some point soon. We haven't fully decided exactly what date it's going to begin, but soon what you'll see is we're going to join forces. The ThreatCast team, the CTU Live team, all going to come together and we're going to deliver one big, awesome sort of threats and cybersecurity related, information sharing session, which, with the best bits of both sessions. All right, that's enough of my voice. Let's get Morgan on stage. And Morgan, why don't you take us through the threat landscape?
Will do. Thank you very much, Greg. Hello, friends. Hope everyone's enjoying their day so far. Let's get started with some threat landscape topics here. So per usual, we're going to start off with some vulnerabilities. So this first vulnerability, CVE 2025-53690. This vulnerability affects Sitecore XP 9.0 and Active Directory 1.4, specifically when they're using a publicly documented sample ASP.NET machine key. And the problem is that with a known key, an attacker can craft malicious view state payloads, which can ultimately lead to remote code execution. And if you're like, what does that even mean? It sounds like a bunch of mumbo jumbo. So for some quick context, ASP.NET is a server-side web application framework developed by Microsoft specifically for building dynamic web pages, applications, and services. And view state is how ASP.NET keeps track of a page's state between requests. So normally it's protected by a machine key to ensure integrity and confidentiality. But if that key is predictable or reused, like the sample one, an attacker can generate their own view state data and slip it in undetected. And in this case, some endpoints were exposed without requiring authentication, which made exploitation easier. So this vulnerability has been exploited in the wild and has led to reported data theft, though we at Sophos have not observed it directly in our customer base as of yet. Sitecore has since updated their deployments to automatically generate unique machine keys, which kind of closes the door on this specific issue. But for defense going forward, organizations should make sure that they regularly rotate their machine keys. They should also confirm that ViewState MAC is always enabled and just generally avoid storing sensitive information in plain text inside web.config files. And these steps will help reduce the risk of this type of attack. The second vulnerability that we're going to be talking about here, and the last vulnerability we're going to be talking about today, is CVE 2025-10159. Now, this vulnerability affects Sophos' AP6 series wireless access points, specifically those running older firmware. And the issue here is an authentication bypass that could allow an attacker who can reach the management IP to escalate directly to administrator privileges. So the good news about this one is that it was discovered internally by Sophos during routine security testing. It was not found nor publicly exploited in the wild. And for most customers, no action is needed here since the default update policy automatically installs firmware updates. And this fix was included in the firmware version 1.7.2563, which was released after August 11th. And the key takeaway here is pretty simple. We wanted to inform you guys of our discovery of this vulnerability and our patching of it, but also, in terms of advice, always ensure your AP6 devices are running the latest firmware. If you are on an older version and updates for some reason aren't happening automatically, you will need to manually upgrade in order to stay protected. So that's a coverage of 2 vulnerabilities from the last month. Now let's head into some of our notable news. So over the last month or two, we've seen a wave of NPM supply chain attacks where threat actors hijacked maintainer and publisher accounts and then used those accounts to inject malware into widely used NPM packages, which ultimately resulted in the compromise of hundreds of packages that have millions of weekly downloads. And this kind of broke up into 3 major incidents. So on August 26th, there was the NX Singularity attack. And how this one kind of went down is the attackers exploited a CI pipeline vulnerability in the NX project to steal an NPM publishing token and push out malicious versions of the NX toolset. So for about 4 hours, Trojanized NX packages were available on NPM, and these ran a post-install script that scanned developers' machines for sensitive data and uploaded that sensitive data to public GitHub repositories. Now, the NX team was able to quickly remove the malicious releases and implement things like NPM trusted publisher signing and manual release approvals to hopefully prevent a repeat of this event. But only about a week later, on September 8th, another similar type of compromise occurred. This time, a maintainer of the popular libraries known as Chalk and Debug was phished with a fake NPM two-factor authentication email. And so through this phishing email, the attacker was able to hijack the maintainer's account and publish malicious versions of these Chalk and Debug packages. I think there's about 18 affected packages with about 2 billion or something weekly downloads, which seems like an insane number to think about. With these malicious versions, the applications that were pulling the new versions, they would basically unknowingly be installing a browser-based script that detects cryptocurrency wallet activity and silently hijacks those crypto transactions to redirect the funds to the attacker's wallet. So it's basically a browser-based cryptocurrency interceptor. And then the third and arguably most severe NPM supply chain attack from the past month took place between September 14th and 16th. And so that same group from that NX incident that we just talked about is believed to have struck again with a massive worm-like supply chain attack. So they used accounts and tokens that were likely stolen from that NX Singularity attack, and they used those to insert a self-replicating worm into a bunch of popular NPM packages. So when any infected package was installed, that payload would run automatically, and it would download and execute what's known as the Truffle Hog scanner to steal additional NPM credentials, AWS keys, and general sensitive information. And then it would exfiltrate that information into a public GitHub repo, which is branded Shai-Hulud. And that's not all. If the malware did indeed find those additional valid NPM credentials on an infected system, it would then use those credentials to spread itself, the malware, across all other packages owned by the same maintainers. And what that resulted in is a very rapid ongoing spread of this worm across the NPM ecosystem. I believe it was over 180 NPM packages across multiple maintainers were initially compromised, which later escalated to, I believe, nearly 500 packages that were infected with this worm. And the broader concern here is the overall escalating targeting of NPM packages. Targeting NPM packages in this way is not a totally new, novel thing, but the fact that these packages sit at the foundation of countless applications and development pipelines Compromising them gives attackers a shortcut into many organizations at once. The fact that we've been seeing these 3 similar NPM supply chain attacks all within quick succession is, cause for concern, because it shifts the risk from being about like one company's perimeter to the entire software ecosystem that they rely on. And reports suggest that exposure for major enterprises, I think there was a lot of talk about how CrowdStrike's NPM scope was abused, and then other widely used packages like Debug and Chalk underpin apps at Microsoft, Netflix, Slack, and countless other apps and startups. So the key takeaway here is that supply chain compromises like this really amplify risk at scale. And that's why the defensive advice is so critical. Try to use allow lists or internal registries to only pull vetted packages. Try to pin dependency versions and make sure to thoroughly review and audit updates before you roll them out. And overall, if applicable, try to audit your GitHub repositories for possibly injected or compromised NPM packages. And then the last story we're going to be talking about here is a sales drift supply chain incident. So on August 26th, SalesLoft Drift reported a widespread data theft campaign leveraging stolen OAuth and refresh tokens that were associated with the Drift artificial intelligence chat agent. And they used these OAuth tokens in order to breach and exfiltrate data from multiple customers' Salesforce instances. And this campaign appears primarily motivated by credential theft, so stealing things like AWS access keys, passwords, and Snowflake-related tokens. But this reportedly took place between August 8th and August 18th. But it's believed that the threat group, which is tracked as UNC6395, gained long-term access to SalesLoft's GitHub environment going back months ago, where they were able to exfiltrate code and OAuth tokens before they pivoted into the Drift infrastructure to pull off this credential harvesting campaign. And in terms of victim, I think it was reported that over 700 organizations globally were reported to have been impacted, including some very high-profile names that publicly not acknowledged this exposure, including Cloudflare, Zscaler, Palo Alto, and more. The good news is that over at Sophos, we have confirmed that Sophos, SecureWorks, and our own Salesforce environments are not impacted. But overall, Salesforce is a very popular target for attackers. In June, there were reports about a voice phishing or a vishing campaign led by another threat group, tracked as UNC6040. And in this phishing campaign, they posed as IT support and they tricked employees into installing a malicious version of Salesforce's data loader, which allowed them to infiltrate around 20 organizations and perform large-scale data theft and extortion. All of this together, overall, Salesforce holds some extremely valuable corporate data that can be used to fuel spear phishing, business email compromise, or account takeover campaigns. And in this SalesLoft Drift case, the attacker specifically searched for cloud credentials hidden within Salesforce records, which can be used for follow-on cloud intrusions. And that being said, Salesforce is rarely isolated. It's tied to tools like Slack, ServiceNow, HubSpot, AWS, custom APIs, which makes it an ideal pivot point. Compromise Salesforce, and you often can get downstream access into other software as a service or cloud platforms. And so from a defense perspective, the advice is relatively straightforward. Treat any auth tokens connected to Drift as potentially compromised. Try to review all third-party integrations tied to your Drift instance and proactively mitigate risk by revoking those exposed API keys or rotating credentials where needed. And that should finish us up for threat landscape. I will now pass it on to my friend Colin to talk a little bit about our observed threat activity.
Thank you, Morgan, for that introduction and covering some of the recent news and threat landscape. Let's take a look at what we're seeing within Sophos Managed Detection Response and our incident response services over this month so far. First, taking a look at the most active ransomware, the top 5 ransomware this month to date includes Akira, Shinobi, Lynx, PlayCrypt, and Keelan ransomware. The only one in this group that is net new and only recently emerged is Shinobi ransomware. There's some reports that this is a ransomware as a service that maybe bought its ransomware as a service code from Lynx ransomware. However, at this time, we're still investigating these claims as we've continued to see both Lynx and Shinobi active at the same time. Meanwhile, Akira and PlayCrypt are a bit more elusive in nature. It's not exactly clear whether they operate a ransomware as a service program. However, it's noted that they do not widely advertise on forums. Meanwhile, Keylin ransomware is a very widely advertised ransomware as a service program that caters specifically towards Russian-speaking affiliates. In regards to how our cases are actually starting that lead to ransomware, we've noted over this month so far, the main initial access vectors are related to VPN appliances and exposed servers. Specifically, we're continuing to see a large volume of cases related to Sonic Wall VPN, as well as Fortinet and in some cases Sophos XG. And then we've also seen a handful of cases involving brute forcing of RD Web, which is a Microsoft Remote Access tool, as well as just traditional Microsoft Remote Desk Protocol, or RDP. In terms of why these platforms are being breached, the main reason is because of a lack of multi-factor authentication on VPN appliances and compromised credentials. We've also noted cases involving unpatched systems, as well as unprotected assets, and of course some cases with malicious downloads. Now let's go ahead and move on to some specific case studies from this month related to browser-based malware distribution. The first threat that I wanted to highlight is called Tamper Chef. You may have saw some MDR cases related to this, and this is actually a threat that we've been tracking for multiple years as a browser hijacker. There are a few different other families of browser hijackers, but this particular one, Tamper Chef, is distributed through malicious advertising on platforms like Google. On the bottom left, you can see here some of the themes that they use, as well as on the right side of the screen, you can see some of their websites that they use to distribute this malware. Specifically, they mainly go after PDF converters, but we've also seen them setting up websites around recipes, as well as manuals that might be for different enterprise appliances or home appliances. After the initial malware is downloaded, this particular threat will hijack the user's browser, and the way they do that is by installing a secondary browser that overwrites the main user's browser. And then in terms of what is the end objective, there's some publications out there that have mentioned that this threat is capable of stealing credentials. And in our observations, we haven't found any concrete evidence that they have successfully exfiltrated credentials out of a victim's network. However, it is possible with the update mechanisms that they have that potentially the threat actor could leverage this malware to perform some sort of targeted attack against high-value targets and steal browser-based credentials. But based on our analysis, the main objective of this malware is to perform ad fraud, as well as affiliate referral program fraud. So we've identified through our malware analysis that the threat actors will deliver a customized configuration file, which is aware of thousands of different affiliate programs. For an example, if you purchase something on Amazon, if you clicked on a link that is an affiliate link, the person that distributed that link might get paid for you buying something. And so they leverage this type of wide-scale malware campaign primarily to target consumers, particularly consumers with bad IT hygiene who might not notice that they have an unwanted program. So in the past, we've tracked this threat as a potentially unwanted program, or PUA. However, due to updates by the threat actor and their evasive techniques to remain persistent on victim systems, as well as some of their capabilities to download additional configurations, our labs team has promoted this particular family of software from an unwanted program into malicious software or malware. Another threat that we've seen being distributed through the browser is known as Oyster, or Oyster Backdoor. This is a malware as a service that first showed up last summer, and it's directly tied to ransomware, particularly ransomware as a service. I wanted to share some details about an MDR case where we helped prevent action on objective. An IT administrator searched on Bing for a tool called PuTTY. PuTTY is useful for remotely managing systems across an internal network. And unfortunately, this particular user clicked on a malicious advertisement that took them to a fake website, which downloaded a Trojanized version of PuTTY. So while it did have the legitimate PuTTY application packaged in the download. It also had malicious code that established command and control access and attempted to establish persistency on the device. This triggered various Sophos detections, such as a low rep download and a persist 20A detection that initiated an MDR case. Within just 5 minutes of the initial download, the threat actors were at their keyboard attempting to escalate their access with the end goal of having full network control. Some of the things that they did was start to perform reconnaissance of what user they are, what group is that user in, what other groups are in the network, and where are other network shares. They also particularly looked for plain text credential storage, both on the actual device of the user as well as on network share. So these could be things like scripts that have a hard-coded password, but in some cases, if an IT administrator maybe doesn't have the best security practices, they may have plain text credentials in an Excel document, which is certainly very helpful for a threat actor. Within just 28 minutes of the initial download, the MDR operations team had concluded their investigation that this was malicious and reached out to the customer and established a phone connection. At this point in time, the remediation efforts begin, but due to the threat actor's privileged access and quick ability to perform reconnaissance, they maintained access to the environment through a privileged account. And what we observed is that 8 hours after the initial infection, the threat actors started a secondary attempt to try to gain more access to the network. This included performing an attack called DC Sync, which is leveraged to gain credentials, as well as attempting to dump the Windows Active Directory NTDS credentials database, which has hashed password credentials. These both triggered Sophos detections, which started a secondary case and escalated our priority in remediation. Ultimately, the MDR team was able to isolate these critical servers, get a touch with the victim again, and prevent any action on objectives from happening. The entire case took just 8 hours, but we have some insight from our rapid response team into what would have happened if this case was not handled properly. Particularly, we've identified a relationship between this malware family called Oyster and two different ransomware families, one of which is called Resida, which has been around for several years, and then a newer ransomware group called Nitrogen. We observed Oyster leading to Nitrogen in 2025, and then in 2024 is when we made that connection to Resida. On the top left of the screen here, you can see an example of a malicious advertisement on Google that recently led to Oyster. And one of the notable things here is from the user's perspective, this looks really legitimate. It says www.putty.org, which is the legitimate domain of this tool. However, this is actually abusing the Google platform and a feature that they have called template tracking. And after clicking on this link, it would take you to a different website that's not putty.org. So it just goes to show that when you're downloading tools, particularly as a privileged user, it's really important to fully inspect where you're actually downloading those tools from. And some of the other targeted software primarily includes more technical tools. And the reason why is that threat actors would prefer to have technical users, which might have more access or more privileges from the get-go. And just as a general call out, some of the things that will make life harder for these threat actors is auditing Active Directory dormant accounts. These threat actors love to go after domain administrators and other privileged users. And so by limiting accounts that you don't need in your Active Directory network, it can help make life harder. And as I mentioned earlier, plain text credential storage is a very important control for preventing access escalation. That's it for this month's observed threat activity. Now I'll be handing the mic over to Paul to talk about some of our threat hunting highlights.
All right. Thanks so much, Colin. Well, thank you guys for joining, and we will be diving into some interesting threat hunts from the last month or so. So starting off, one that I thought would be interesting to highlight is Rockstar 2FA. So you likely have seen some of our previous blogging on this and coverage on other ThreatCasts. But the reason I thought this made sense to cover is because it highlights that we don't just kind of hunt once and then move on. As new intelligence comes out, we will rehunt and revisit things and test our previous assumptions. And that's kind of what happened with this particular case. The Intel and Ops folks that track this activity had noticed that the Rockstar 2FA activity had somewhat dropped off. And taking that as a cue, they then researched and looked and identified new infrastructure that we hadn't previously seen and fed that information back into our hunt team. So they were able to construct a hunt that leveraged this new intelligence and found quite an additional bit of activity. So as you can see on the bottom there, the 64 customers were impacted, and we've notified all those customers, as well as we were able to introduce a new detection that took advantage of this new intelligence. And then what you'll see is a reference to Salty 2FA. So this is something that we're tracking here within the Intel team, and there has been some public reporting that is linking the two. Potentially Rockstar has links to Salty 2FA based on common infrastructure at this point. So something that we're keeping an eye on and waiting to see if this is a full-on rebrand or just simply an infrastructure overlap at this point. So diving a little bit more into the technical details, you can see on our next slide the actual query that was run, or maybe you can't see because it is very long, but it's essentially the query is extracting out the session ID from the properties field within our O365 data just using regex. It's also grabbing out the user agent, and that allows us then to pull the client connection information and use a join statement to then pull in the GeoIP. And that was essentially one of the key attributes of the campaign, was a certain subnet that they were using to then log into customer accounts. And then lastly, with the query, you'll see the where statements and the case statements that are matching on a very specific application ID, object ID, and then the subnet that the attacker was using. So not a very complex hunt, but it did yield very good results with 64 customers that we were able to identify and notify them of activity in their environment. So look for more to come on Salty 2FA as the Intel team tracks that as well. Moving on to our next hunt. This hunt is a little interesting because it's a little novel, and it shows how the attackers are, constantly able to kind of evolve their techniques. So if you are familiar, if you're a Linux user or Unix user, you may be familiar with the tool DD, or Data Duplicator. And that's a common tool that is just native to the Linux environment, but not so much on the Windows side. You don't tend to see it on the Windows side. And what happened in this case is that we actually observed in one of our operations case, an incident, a threat actor using this tool on the Windows side to effectively conduct a wiping attack and zero out, data files. And so we took that information and then said, well, this is novel technique. Let's look at across all of our customers and see if we can identify that activity. So we're able to identify one additional customer that was impacted, as well as issue a new PUA detection, so potentially unwanted application. So that's available to customers now. And I would suggest that you turn that on for your Windows hosts to block this application. But I do want to highlight kind of a known false positive, though, on our next slide here, just so you're aware of it. And I'll give you a quick overview of how the tool operates. So the tool, as you can see in the screenshots, essentially just takes in your input file, which is typically going to be a device, and then an output file, which is another device. So it's very geared towards Linux, but with the cross-porting can also work on Windows. But the known false positive that I want to mention is exactly the sanitization aspect. So it's a tool that somebody will use to sanitize or zero out or wipe a thumb drive or an external hard drive. And that's something that we see commonly. So hence we didn't want to create a straight up blocking rule. And the PUA essentially is a little bit better control for that going forward. So what we did see, though, in the one attack within the customers was that the TAs were targeting backups and virtual disks, and that's what they targeted by zeroing out the files. And then to give you some insight into the query itself, this one, fortunately, is much easier to go through. It's kind of one of our standard queries, just looking for the process parent, path, and file information out of our running processes table, and then filtering out on the options that you saw on the previous screen. So input file, block size, and output file. So just to make sure that it's a valid command that's executing. So overall, that was just something that I thought was worth highlighting because it's interesting to see a Linux tool being used on Windows systems for a threat actor. All right. And then the last hunt that we'd like to cover actually is quite interesting, and it aligns a lot with the Salesforce Sales Loft drift attack that Morgan highlighted earlier. OAuth is just a chronic problem these days. With a modern environment, it's very heavy on software as a service, and there's a lot of third-party integrations into those SaaS apps. And so the OAuth token is very important for making those applications work. However, with all the third parties involved, not all of them have the same security controls on those OAuth tokens as we would want to have. Specifically around token expiration, which we'll get into in the next slide. But with this particular attack, one thing that was interesting is that this didn't take advantage of a benign app. This is actually a malicious app that's published by Horizon Tech. And so the malicious app was installed, and then the threat actor actually, once it was installed, was able to use it for internal phishing. So very, very hard to prevent that when you get an email internally from a trusted employee in your organization. You're essentially getting phished from behind enemy lines there at that point. So that one was particularly nasty. One of the outcomes, though, is that we were able to produce a new detection, which you can see there at the bottom, which was the SaaS M365 consent to application. We included that as a known abused app. Okay, and moving on into the OAuth explanation that I promised. So you can see here from the diagram, it's essentially how Microsoft applies the OAuth 2 standard, where a user feeds their credentials into the client, and then the client gets authenticated, and then the token is issued. So it's giving it authorization. What can you access? So authorization and authentication are two very different things. The problem with that is then that token that authorizes them to do certain actions within that application can be reused without requiring any authentication. So, and the expiration times can vary. Sometimes, you'd like for those to be valid for, 8 hours a workday. But sometimes they can go on indefinitely or stretch for weeks at a time. And that's why we particularly want to point out that, third-party applications need to audit those and confirm what their configurations and standards are for their OAuth tokens. And then to go over the query itself for this particular hunt, this is, leveraging our M365 identity table. We are extracting out, just using regex, the ID, the type, and the scope of the activity. And that gives us the granted permission. So we kind of know that whether or not permission was granted, and then that allows us to filter down from all the applications that are just that we don't need to worry about that don't have additional permissions. Further, we extract the user agent as well as other client OWA information. And then the last action is to filter down to the operation where a user has consented to that application having access. So that's the query in a nutshell, but wanted to highlight the risk of OAuth in your organization. And I will hand it over to Greg for the next section.
Thanks, Paul. So what we'll do is to look through what's been going on in XOps, so the research that's been going on. Only a few interesting pieces this month, but they're still really good. First one, classics. It's the Patch Tuesday. What's gone on in September? Couple of privilege escalations, remote code executions, your standard run-of-the-mill Patch Tuesday. I'm sure, as always, many of you will have good hygiene or be buying these patches in regular cadence, but do check it out and make sure you've got them all relevant ones in there. I think the remote code execution one I'm thinking of was for the high-performance compute. So if you are using HPC, do check that one out. The next piece then is Gold Sale and Warlock. Just another really great piece looking at the tradecraft of a ransomware actor. Definitely worth going and check it out. This kind of dissemination about how they behave and so on is great to understand the kind of threat vectors that we're seeing from them. And then the last one is actually really interesting one. So this was what happens when a cybersecurity company gets phished, i.e. what happens when Sophos gets phished. This is a recent story where one of our employees was phished, and I think it gives you an insight into how we operate when something like that happens and the kind of security culture that we have internally. So firstly, there was nothing impacted. However, if you're interested, not only is there this article, we did also publish it to our trust center. So like any vulnerability in our own products, even with a phish internally, we publish it on the trust center and you can go and see the information in there. The bit I think that really stood out to me and is something I wanted to repeat out here in the ThreatCast was the part that we don't reprimand individuals for making these kind of mistakes. There's a persistent threat with phishing. Threat actors are constantly trying every different permutation of attack to get your employees. And I think if you have a culture where your employees are scared to speak up, to contact security, to make it known that they may have made a mistake, or even if they've got the slightest suspicion, then you're going to have a chilling effect on your employees actually reaching out when the worst happens. And again, I think internally we don't have that kind of problem. People reach out, mention that things are going on, and this was actually a senior member of staff that made this mistake. And again, it's something that we accept that is part of the threat, the attacks the threat landscape that we're going to be facing as an organization. And I think it's something I think a lot of organizations can take away from that, which is if you want your employees to flag up when the worst happens, you need to make it okay to fail. Right, even though it is pretty awful when it does. Another nice note was just the fact that I think we're really blessed in Sophos to have, not only do we have our own internal security operations center, but we're also, that SOC is extended with Sophos Labs, the MDR team, our incident response teams, our threat research teams, and so on. And so it meant that we're able to pull on a lot of resources when these things happen. But again, even though it did occur, we go and look at not only what controls failed, because some controls did fail for it to succeed, but also what controls then after the initial threat sort of took place, what controls then sort of protected it, and we also go and audit those. And I think that's a great thing for everyone to take away, is that when your controls succeed or fail, we always go and look when they fail because we know we need to do something, but often we don't think there's any action when something doesn't go wrong, when the control does its job. But it's still worth going and looking at the controls that saved your metaphorical bacon in that instance, and then try and understand how could this control fail. And that's what we did, and we start modeling and trying to understand, okay, well, these are the ones that sort of mitigated this threat, but what do we need to do to make sure that these controls have additional kind of strength and for us to start predicting how they might be circumnavigated in the future. Really cool piece. I think it's worth reading if you want to see what happens when we get phished. Hopefully it'll give you a little bit of confidence in how we treat these things. And I was quite impressed at the speed at which it made it to the trust center and we disseminated this information. That was quite reassuring for me. Alrighty, we've hit the Q&A section. So as always, if you've got any questions, do fire them in the Q&A panel. I've got a few questions here already. Before I do that, while I let anyone finish furiously typing into the Q&A box, just to let you know, we do the MDR threat brief. So every week we publish something to the community channel. Go check that out. Just check out the MDR community channel in general. And also the further reading here, we have all the references, but these will be posted to the community channel, including the video recording and the queries, the hunt queries and everything we published at this point, roughly next 72 hours or so. All right, let's go look through those questions. So I think I'm just going to skim through. Do I need to call on anyone for these? I don't think I do. I think I might just rattle through these. Sorry, that just saves people jumping in and out on the stage. Okay, so the first one is, I've not heard of Sitecore before. Is there a chance I could be using it without realizing? So Sitecore is it's a kind of a content management sort of platform for delivering websites. I don't believe, however, I can't be 100% on this. I don't believe any vendors are actually utilizing Sitecore behind the scenes to deliver their product. However, there are many websites out there and services that use Sitecore to back their platform. So they will have something they need to be going and patching. But it's unlikely, if you're not aware of running Sitecore directly, especially since you'll be licensing it, it's not a free product, then yeah, you should be okay. But again, it runs on Microsoft IIS. There were some interesting aspects to that. Actually, this next question kind of feeds into that. IIS and Microsoft Web Server is an interesting web server, especially if you come from like an Nginx or an Apache background. And this question here was interesting. So it said, isn't web.config a plain text file? Which is quite true in a lot of web servers. The config files for them are typically plain text. So how do you avoid storing plain text info in it? With some multiple question marks. So Microsoft IIS has this thing called protected configuration. So it's a really cool feature, which I'm actually, I'm not au fait that much with Microsoft's web servers. I've only used them probably about 10 years ago now. But protected configuration is a way for you to add a way to store basically encrypted values inside your config, so that if someone does compromise your host, isn't able to go into the web.config and extract keys and so on, because they themselves and the config itself is protected. So yeah, check out protected configuration. Really, really cool feature of IIS. The next question is, we're a reasonably large org and have a number of developers using JavaScript and Python regularly for various projects. Do you have any general recommendations to reduce the risk of supply chain attacks like this? So this is going back to the NPM. So when we're talking about the NPM or the Node package manager, that is something that's effectively part of the JavaScript ecosystem for the JavaScript programming language. And there's also, Python. There's also, there's Ruby gems. There's all sorts of, every programming language out there probably has its own package repository. And there's a lot of risks with using them, especially in corporate environments where supply chain attacks are a big thing. Threat actors really want to go after these packages because that you're going to get, as Colin said, you're going to get onto a technical user's host. It's already a really powerful way to get inside an environment. There's a variety of really cool tools out there. The first thing is Python. So Python's package manager is pip. The Node one is npm. So there's pip-audit, there's npm-audit. There's these tools that let you quickly audit the packages for any known vulnerabilities. So that's always worth using. There's also a wild suggestion: if you're a large enough organization, do perhaps consider running your own repository. So rather than actually, letting your employees go directly out to the official package managers, perhaps have your own cache of known packages where perhaps you're delaying the point at which a package is made available. There's a variety of other solutions out there, but I know many organizations are turning to this themselves. There's also, Snyk or Snyk, SNYK. Again, I think that's probably a premium service, but I'm sure there's competitors to them as well. But Snyk has Snyk Advisor, which lets you go and look at the reputation of packages and just gives you some additional data points when looking at a package, so you can you can sort of vet it before you allow it. But I guess the last part is there needs to really be a big overhaul to how a lot of these packages are deployed. I think a big part is all this use of tokens and API keys and so on are easily stolen, and then of course a threat actor can use them to go and release their own malicious versions of these things and get things into these package managers. So there is the OpenSSF Securing Software Repositories Working Group. So there's a sort of industry collaborative group that is looking at this problem, and they've got this concept called trusted publishing that's coming ahead. And I think, especially in light of this recent NPM attack, and there's just been one too many at this point, we're probably going to see some changes to how packages and package managers operate, especially with just how they're published. And to try and get away from this world of API keys. And that actually kind of takes me to this next question, because it's back on what Paul was talking about with OAuth. Another question was, what things can we do to protect against token theft like we saw in Horizon? So, threat actors know that you're either authenticating into applications just for, access, and you're getting a token back from that application, so that you don't have to keep logging in every time you open your browser. Your browser caches a token. And the same thing with publishing to package repos and so on, or uploading things to GitHub, you often get like an API key or a token that is issued to you. And there needs to be a shift from this. And so, yes, we're going to see many shifts. The big thing, especially with OAuth, is this thing called demonstrating proof of possession, or DPoP. It's an extension for OAuth 2.0. I think I said that correctly. I'm not 100% certain. But demonstrating proof of possession, or DPoP, is a way that instead of you being sort of issued a token that anyone else can steal and take to their machine, instead you're issued a token which is sort of uses some cryptography, right? Some asymmetric encryption, so that token will only work if it comes from the endpoint that initially requested it. The idea that means, like, I'm logging into something and I get given back a token, but that token is then bound to me on my machine. And the way that encryption takes place is to use something like a security token. You know, we've all seen them, these little dongle things that you plug in or you tap or whatever. But these cryptographic tokens, I think, are a really important thing. And I know MFA, you know, so time-based one-time passwords with like 2FA apps are helpful, and I'm sure most people have only just got used to those. But I think more and more we need to start switching towards passkeys and hardware-based tokens, because it's going to enable this world where, especially as DPoP and demonstrated proof of possession, this new standard kind of becomes commonplace, you can use those tokens so that anyone that tries to hack your browser, intercept the token, or use it can't use it, because they don't have your hardware token. And that being a physical device, that is not then something they can hack into the machine and pull the keys off of, because it's a physical device. They don't have access to it. It really kind of starts knocking these threat vectors on their heads. So yeah, keep an eye out for the kind of new trusted publishing thing from OpenSSF, DPoP, demonstrating proof of possession, and other standards for like OAuth. We're going to start to see some shifts, and I'm sure if you haven't already, start thinking about those kind of hardware-based security tokens. They are going to start enabling a much better world in the future. The last question, if we have time. Yeah, we have time. The last question was, I've lost it. Scroll. There we go. How can we stop users downloading apps in the first place? So they've got so this was going back to which section? This will be, and this probably one of the binaries that came from one of these malicious advertising campaigns. Yeah, so if you've got users that especially users that are downloading like binaries and so on, you just want to kind of get that closed off fell swoop. I can talk about the kind of preventative controls we have, but if you're using other vendors for these things, like especially your firewalls, look into their documentation. But for instance, for our endpoint, we have something called web control, which does have some mitigations where you can go in and just say these file types can't be downloaded. But that doesn't always, it's not perfect, it's not fail safe, because I think there's a couple of scenarios like certain encrypted traffic that can't handle it. So that's where like your firewalls really come into play. So the Sophos XG has two things. One is, of course, the web and email policies where you can block file types, but it's also the SSL TLS inspection. So like being able to decrypt the encrypted traffic to then go and analyze it. Is a binary coming down here, then block that. So yeah, go look into sort of your web solutions that you've got, and start knocking those down. I see there's another question here that I missed as well, which is, hang on, I want to put that over here so I can read it better. Is there a place to look at that would have a list applications that could be used for an attack, like PuTTY, for an example, we could look for that might be installed in our environment? Yeah, so this is the common, I think the question they're trying to ask here is like, what are the kind of common applications being used by threat actors to kind of spoof and so on? So an attack like PuTTY, I think Colin gave a good little list. Let me just jump back to the slides, put it on the screen. Kind of the common targeted applications, but this is specifically where a threat actor is trying to lure you to a compromised or malicious web page to download a binary you don't want. That isn't the official thing, like PuTTY, WinSCP, Chrome, and so on. But it really can be anything. I think a better way to approach this is, rather than looking at for a specific list of applications that you want to control and try and figure out, is you should hopefully have an inventory of the applications that exist in your environment. Or if you don't, that's a great first step. You want to have an inventory of all the applications and components that exist, in your environment. There's many tools out there. I used to recommend one and I've forgotten it. But yeah, you're looking for sort of software inventory, automated software inventory tools. And once you have that kind of list and understand what should be being used, so what do you expect, and is there anything on here that you don't expect? Things like our application control for endpoint, you can go into that policy and just start blocking everything that you don't want. And so if you, for instance, let's say you do use WinSCP but don't use PuTTY or don't use, I don't know, some FileZilla or something else like that, then you allow WinSCP and block the rest. The other thing you can do with our application control tool, which is quite handy, so if you go into your endpoint policies in Central, look at the application control policy specifically. In application control, you can set it to monitor mode. So you can have it generating you a list of detections for things that we've seen, but not necessarily go and block it immediately, right? And that at least lets you get that first inventory of what's going on, and then you can understand what's out there. And then Paul's put in the Q&A panel as well, which what I'll do is I'll copy and paste that into the chat, because I think our Q&A thing might be private still. But there's a couple of queries that you can use to go and look at what's on your endpoints using the discovery feature, so Live Discover, the querying features that we use for threat hunting. You could also use to go and find installed applications and things like that. Alrighty, that was a lot. I don't see any other questions. I'll take one last look. I don't. Alrighty, I think we've hit the end. So thank you all for being here. Thank you so much for your interest. Again, here's the sort of the references. Feel free to take a quick screenshot, but they will be posted to the MDR community channel in the next 72 hours or so. But with that, I'd just like to say thank you for taking a concerned interest in what's going on in the wider threat landscape. I always say this, but I really mean it, by us sitting here talking about what's going on, communicating, even just bringing up, edge questions that maybe not related just to Sophos, but just talking about cybersecurity and joining together, being one team, really helps us sort of try and stay at pace or ahead of threat actors, so that they can't come and hose our environments. All right, thank you so much for your time. If you have, as I always say, stay watchful, stay vigilant, and if you have any concerns, do not hesitate to contact Sophos MDR team at your earliest point, or earliest convenience. I've stammered the way through that. All right, I'm sure you're leaving anyway. Thanks so much for being here. All right, we'll see you next time.